because also part of your story is that you came up in subculture. You came up in skateboarding. You came up in music. So how did that find you coming from such a small town and pre-internet?
I think, I mean, that was when I got exposed to the much wider world, right? So when I was all the way up to 10th grade, I was really a role-playing geek, right? So I was playing chess, I was doing role-playing on Friday and Saturday.
Like Dungeons and
Yes,
Dragons?
yes. So I was the nerd. And then I spent a year in the United States. And this is where I saw all these cool skateboard kids and all the cool t-shirts. And I mean, since I was an unknown person in that context, I thought, okay, this is an opportunity to start to live a different side of what has always been in me, right? So I bought a skateboard. I started to skate. I was never very good at it, I have to say. But I got drawn into this entire subculture, right? So I bought the Thrasher magazine. I found out about all these musics that I've never heard about before, right? All these cool t-shirts. And that is what first attracted me to this, right? And this is also where I came across, punk rock, hardcore, and the things. Back when I was a kid, right? You had this impression punk rock is all for the people, right, that tear down, downtown places. There were all these big riots in Hanover here in Germany. And so on. You had this very strange perspective on what punk rock is, right? That it's completely destructive, right? That it's nihilism, it's live fast, die young. And then I realized, no, there's actually a different side to this, right? It's more about rebellion. It's more about being constructive, right? Trying to be the person that you actually would like to be, right? And that is something that I found very attractive.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. When I first started hearing about like punk, I didn't know there was a thing called hardcore. When I first started hearing about it as a very, very young kid, I thought it was like a dangerous thing, like a bad thing.
Yep.
And when I was more exposed to it through skateboarding and the ideas of creativity, the liberty to think in different ways, even like the skateboard graphics and how like they could kind of juxtapose death and life together. You'd have all these skulls, but then you'd be out skateboarding and creating all these things and doing these things. The whole thing just catapulted me into a totally different way of thinking. And it's funny that it's kind of encapsulated or it's kind of coded in all of this seeming negativity, but when you just get a little bit deeper, it's actually like a very life-affirming.
Absolutely.
So you were there. You told me something that I didn't know about you when we were chatting. So you were in the Dakotas. You were in South Dakota,
Yes,
was it?
South Dakota.
So,
yeah.
But you'd already come from kind of quite a small town, and then you went to the Dakotas. So it was similar but different.
Well, it was a step up, I have to say, right? Because I come from a village, 800 people. Right, and there I think they had a population of around 12,000 people, so that was already a step up for me, right? And I remember, when I got the news, when you have these dreams, you go to the United States for a year, right? You have all these ideas going to California, right, Florida, I don't know, right? So I remember, how disappointed I was, but then when I arrived there, I really enjoyed it. It was a great time.
It was kind of like a lottery system. You didn't know where you were going to go,
yes,
and then they told you South Dakota, and you were disappointed.
Yes. Yeah, initially, right? Because you have no conception of the Midwest if you are in Europe, basically, right? Because your perspective on the United States is driven by Hollywood, right? And yes, you know about the Midwest, but that's because of the cowboy movies. But that's about it, right? But I arrived there, and I think this is, it was, for me, a life-changing year, right? Because it opened my mind, it opened my mind to this understanding how cultures can be very, very different, right? I think it also helped me to understand, how German I am in certain aspects, right? And for me, one of the big things that I learned there was tolerance, right? And at the same time, going back to this, it really also helped me to develop an identity. It was a much larger city, at least compared to where I grew up. Right, and they did have these different subcultures, right? They had these skateboard kids, they had these hardcore kids, and so on. Of course, they also had the jocks and they also had the role-playing nerds. But for me, this was an entirely different world that I really, started to, really enjoy. And then at the end of my stay, I got to spend more than 2 months in California because my aunt was staying in North Hollywood at that point. So I also got to hang out in California, and that was obviously amazing.
What were some of the bands you saw?
I saw instead, that was my first hardcore show. I saw Nirvana. I'm opening up for Hole in Dinosaur Jr. at the Palladium in Los Angeles, so way before they became big. I went to the Whiskey and some of the other places. So it was a really, really great time, right? Especially after I got exposed to all this music before, right? And that was very influential this time.
I'm very excited you saw Nirvana and Hole and Dinosaur Jr., but I'm more excited you saw instead. That's really cool. Shout out to Steve and Rich. I love you guys. Okay, so you are this kid who had aspirations to be a professor ever since you were quite young. Then you kind of got into the idea of journalism. Eventually, you find your path into academia. And what's interesting is you start with this very small experience, like very, very little town, role-playing nerd, all of those kinds of things. Your words, not mine. Get into a bigger subculture. But when you get into academia, you join another subculture because academia is a very distinct subculture, just like punk and hardcore is. So now you kind of have these two cultures walking side by side.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I think there's a lot of wisdom to this. I've never thought about this in that way, right? But it's true. Academia or management scholars, they also have their codes, they have their gatherings, right? They have their networks, they have their rumors, they have their chit chat, and so on. That is something that I really, really enjoyed, right? That was also, a big part, that you do have this global community, right? A global community of people that you see again and again, that you interact with, that you develop ideas with, right? And that is something that I, up to this day, by the end of the day, really, really enjoy, right?
So I'm going to throw out a bit of a challenging question. Both subcultures share something in common, which would be a distrust of authority.
Oh yeah, that's true. That's true.
So for punk and hardcore, it would be distrust of like corporations or the police or any or the government, anything that would be a controlling body. For academia, it would be bosses. It would be the governance of a university or of a college or any of these things. It would be the people who are outside of the classroom making the business decisions.
Absolutely.
So you were on one side of the fence at one point. Did you hold those opinions when you were on that side of the fence?
I think I always had a slightly different view on some of these discussions, right? So first of all, authority for me only resides in public institutions, right? In government institutions, right? So this is something that intellectually I really grew up with. And I remember, that after the financial crisis, I was in this one public university in Denmark, and I remembered a friend coming up to me, right, just after the Lehman bankruptcy, that he's so happy to be at a public university because, right, you are going to have this job for life. And I always thought, I was not opposed to having a lot of uncertainty. But then I read an article in The Economist, right, and that talked a little bit about the state of business schools, how business schools function, and how they are adapting to the ramifications of the financial crisis. And the big punchline of this was that business schools tend to be extremely conservative institutions, very opposed to innovation, for example. And the big punchline was, that business schools should be run more like a business and less like a school. And back then I said, hey, yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I like this. Because that's also what I'm seeing at public institutions, right? Being run as a school, thereby very conservative and so on. And that always had a lot of appeal to me. So when I started to interact with Frankfurt School, right, with the former president here, Udo Steffens, right, my sense was, okay, this is actually a place that is being run like a business and not like a school. And this is something that I really liked, and that also drew me to Frankfurt School.